One thing I'm regularly asked is, how do we exposure blend a panorama? Well, there are two different ways to do it. Firstly, we can blend individual tiles. So I'll take one tile, and let's say I've got two exposures for that tile, a bright exposure and a dark exposure. I'll blend them, then I'll save that. Then I'll blend another tile and another tile and another tile. And then when I'm ready to stitch the panorama, I should have a series of, let's say, 3 or 4 tiles which have already been exposure blended, which merge together. And that's my favorite way of exposure blending a panorama, because it's much easier to get a consistent stitch and auto align compared to the other way. Now, the other way is to merge or stitch all of your tiles separately. So let's say you have a series of brighter exposures. We can stitch all those brighter exposures together. So we've got one big bright panorama. And then we can take all the darker exposures and stitch them together. So we've got one big darker panorama. And then we can merge them in Photoshop and just do a big blend. But the reason why that isn't the most effective way of doing it is because let's say we have all these brighter exposures and we ask Photoshop to create a panorama. Well, it'll do that based on the information in these exposures. So it'll line it all up and merge them. And when we give them the darker set of exposures, there's different information in the darker set of exposures than that of the brighter exposures. There's different brightness and colors, so it'll stitch slightly differently. And you're going to see an example of that later on. Now, before we begin the post-processing, I want to talk a little bit about shooting. So when we shoot panoramas, with each tile, we have to try and have roughly 40% overlap between tiles. So let's say we're shooting one image, then when we pan slightly right or left, we have to make sure we don't pan too much right or left. We have to make sure there's overlap between exposures. And so you can see that as an example in these images here. So that first exposure, you see the big building there. And then when we go to the next exposure, you can still see that big building. And the next exposure, you can see the bridge, and we're overlapping each time with these exposures. And when we do that, it makes it a lot easier for Photoshop to blend exposures. Now, another tip for exposure blending, try not to go too wide in terms of focal length, because the more distortion we have in each tile, the harder it is to stitch and the more distorted it'll be in the final panorama. And that can be really difficult to stitch. Now, I'm not saying that you should never go wide, because sometimes we're shooting a scene which is extremely wide and we've got no choice but to go 14 millimeters or 16 millimeters. So just be prepared for the fact that shooting really wide can actually create a lot of distortion and sometimes make it impossible for Photoshop to stitch the panorama. Now, I've included in this folder 2 videos from my YouTube channel, which you can see. One shows you how to correct distortion, and it shows you different methods to do that. And the next is how to blend difficult panoramas. And often we have difficulty with panoramas because we're shooting so wide. And I'm going to show you in the second example in this video what happens when we shoot really wide and try to create a panorama. We basically squeeze everything down so that it's so small it's hard to really make out our subjects. But we'll also look at how to correct that too. Now let's look at the actual post-processing. Here we have 8 exposures. So this is a 4-tile panorama. And I'm not going to walk you through the blending for each individual tile because that'll take a long time. You'll probably be bored because the blending is the same for each tile. So once you watch the first one, you'll get an idea of how to do the next one and the next one. So let me just show you how to blend the first exposures. So I'm going to open them up in Photoshop. And the exposures I'm referring to are 1A and 1B. So these are our first exposures in the panorama. Now the first thing I want to do is we need to blend in the darker exposure that we have here to recover the highlights in the eye park building. But we also need to prepare our base exposure so it's roughly the right brightness level that we want for a base exposure. So I think this could do with brightening up a tiny amount there, and just maybe bringing up our shadows. And as we blend our exposures, or as we work on each tile, we need to make sure that the tiles are roughly similar in brightness when we're actually editing them. So in tile 2, I'll try to make sure that the brightness of tile 2 is roughly the same as the brightness of tile 1. Now it doesn't matter if there is some inconsistency because Photoshop will fix anything that's extremely inconsistent. Now with the darker exposure, we're going to do exactly what we've done before and bring up this exposure and bring up the shadows even more and bring down the highlights. So I'm going to bring up the exposure even more there, make it nice and bright, and just zoom in to the sign to make sure we've exposed for it. And I think that looks pretty good. So I'm going to zoom out, and now we've basically matched the exposures. I'm going to select both exposures, and I'm going to choose Remove Chromatic Aberration and Enable Profile Corrections. And then I'm going to open them up not as smart objects, but just as images, because we can't create a panorama with smart objects anyway. And we've already prepared our raw files, so everything should be fine. With the images in Photoshop, I'll stack them as usual. And now begins the blending process. So this exposure here is the bright exposure. This is the base exposure, and this is the darker exposure. So to blend them, it's really simple. All we're going to do is I'm going to zoom into this eye park sign, because basically this is the main thing we want to recover. And I'm going to obviously make the darker exposure invisible. Choose Instamask and choose Bright Swan. And there we have the eye park sign. And we want to make it nice and contrasting so all the changes we make stick to this area. And I think that's pretty good. So I'm going to press Select, Black Mask, make my darker exposure visible, press Command and H or Control and H, choose a paintbrush, make my opacity of the brush set to 100%, and then I'm just going to make a smaller brush and paint in the darker exposure. And look how smooth and natural that looks. And now I'm going to zoom down and blend in this sign here. And that feels very satisfying. And so I'm just going to scroll along a little bit and maybe do this petrol station, maybe this shop too, and these signs along here, and this house along here, maybe this light too, and I'm just going to scroll up, and this building here as well, and that one too. So we're getting pretty much all of the highlights here. And there's a strange sort of satisfaction to doing this. I don't know why. Because technically it should probably be a little bit tedious or boring, but I take real enjoyment from just going through each of these areas and just bringing them back a little bit. So technically we're actually finished, but there is one more thing I'm going to do. I'm going to select both of the layers, right click and choose Link Layers. Now it's easier to blend panoramas if we correct as much distortion as possible before blending. So for example, if we bring out the ruler, we can see this building isn't straight, and we can also see the buildings to the left aren't straight. So let's try and straighten these first. Now when I shoot my panoramas, I make sure I've got a lot of space to the left and the right, just in case I need to do some cropping and correction. So I don't really care about this area along here. As long as we're not cutting off this road, that's the most important thing, because this is going to go all the way through the image. So when we correct the distortion, I'm going to press Command and T or Control and T, right click and choose Distort. And I'm going to scroll down a little bit and take this bottom selection and just bring it along. And you'll see we're straightening this up. We're certainly straightening this building up here, and we're not losing any of this road. So I've given myself enough space to work with in the panorama. And this is important for that feeling of completion that I talked about in my composition video. If you click on these selections and then hold down Control, you can make really fine adjustments. So I'm going to check out that building again. That looks pretty straight. And now what about this one? That looks pretty straight too. So I think that's good enough. And I can press OK. And now this image is ready to be saved. Now I'm basically going to do exactly the same thing with every other image. So I'll create the same luminosity mask. I'll create the same adjustments so that we've straightened our images. And then I'm going to stitch them together. So I'm going to fast forward all this bit. You can still see it happening, but I'm going to rejoin you once I've finished blending all these exposures. Now I've finished blending the exposures and correcting the distortion. We have 1B here, 2B, 3B, and 4B, with most of the highlights nicely controlled, but we still got some strong street lights here, which I quite like. Now they're all saved, so I can open up File, Automate, Photo Merge, and choose Add Open Files. Now, even though I've corrected the distortion, there'll probably still be a little bit of distortion to correct, but it shouldn't be too severe. Okay, Photoshop has now stitched the panorama. I'm going to close all of these open windows. We don't need them open anymore. And I'm going to zoom out, and you can see there's been a little bit of distortion where it's stitched them. So to fix that, I first need to merge the layers so it's one layer. Then I can press Command and T, right click and distort, just like we've done before. And I'm going to bring these corners along just to straighten everything up. Now I'm just going to check to see if that's right. So I'm pressing OK and I'm zooming in, and now I'm just going to take the ruler and compare it to these buildings. So that's a little bit off, and that side of that building is a tiny bit off too. And to the left isn't too bad. So I'm going to zoom out a tiny bit, press Command and T or Control and T, right click, go to distort, and I'm just going to bring the top of that image along just to see if we can line up this building. And I think that's done a pretty good job. So if we just compare it to this building, and that one's nice and straight too. So if we press OK, we can take the crop tool and we can crop it down to size. So I'm going to bring it along a little bit here. We want to feature this road going all the way through, and I'm going to crop up here, crop down, not too much, and then the panel's a little bit long, so I'm going to crop to about, let's say here where this junction is, or maybe even before, maybe to one of the buildings. Let's say just where this junction comes around, and then we can press OK. So now that's the final stitched version, and as you can see, all of the highlights are beautifully exposed for. Now you'll notice there's a big dark patch in the middle of the sky, and that's not because the stitching has gone wrong or anything like that. It's just because there's no light source there. You know, to the left we've got the buildings and the street lights, and to the right we've got the bridge and buildings, and here we have nothing, it's just water. So obviously we can open up a little curves layer and make that black by pressing Command and I or Control and I, and then choosing a white paintbrush, and let's say at an opacity of around 50%, we just paint in that area, and that'll just neutralize some of the difference there. And by the way, if you're seeing any banding here, you can see some lines on your video. It's not actually there when you zoom in. It just looks like it in the smaller image. Now we're not going to do any more editing with this image. We're just going to do the panorama. But I've got another example that I want to show you with a landscape, which is much more challenging. And I'm also going to demonstrate why it's better to blend each tile like we've done here than to blend two different panoramas, a bright exposure panorama and a dark exposure panorama. So stick around for that.